Before I even start, I would like to mention that this presentation is an early stage of a research project that I established myself. So I'm open to any questions, suggestions, recommendations. I promise I won't be too annoyed and will take it on board. And also, if you have any questions regarding the projects I've been a member of, please, you're more than happy to act. I'm open to all the questions. You can molest me as long as you can. So my presentation will start with a very short background, and then I will move towards aims of this project and paper. How will I contribute to the field? And I will finish with the part presenting my findings, my research findings. So a number of institutions under National Socialist Administration, the concentration camps in particular, were used as sites of medical research, such as findings vaccines against infections and tropical diseases, pharmaceutical testing for military applications, and various anatomical and anthropological measurements. Auschwitz concentration camp, the most widely recognized symbol of Nazi atrocities, served as a laboratory for testing methods of mass sterilization. Although some 350,000 mentally disabled individuals had been sterilized following the eugenically motivated law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offsprings of 1933, National Socialist authorities quickly seized upon the ability to eradicate the reproduction of unwanted populations following the invasion of the Soviet Union and radicalization of Jewish policy. As a result, in late 1942, the chief of German police in the Reich Ministry of the Inferior Heinrich Himmler assigned 2 doctors to undertake non-surgical sterilization research at Auschwitz. The effects of this were 2 different sets of experiments testing 2 different methods of sterilizing people. The first technique, known as chemical sterilization of women, was practiced by Professor Karl Klauberg at Block 10 in Stammlager, and involved caustic injection into the uterus to induce scarring that would block the fallopian tubes. The other method was carried out by Dr. Horst Schumann and involved destroying gonads by the use of X-rays. A number of irradiated inmates had subsequently removed one or both gonads in order to test effects of radiation. This presentation will focus on male victims, despite the fact that Schumann also experimented on women. The reason why is, as I mentioned in introduction this morning, men haven't been actually developed as a topic, haven't been developed in the historiography, but second of all, Schumann actually sterilized only 10 women, so male were in predominance. Going further with the issues to be developed, I will start with adding life stories to nameless statistics. Although both women and men were victimized by unethical sterilization experiments at Auschwitz, scholarly attention has concentrated nearly exclusively on the experiences of female prisoners, creating a sort of gender monopoly on psychological and physical trauma resulting from sterilization experiments. Unlike Jewish women, for whom one way of dealing with the trauma was creating international support network groups and giving testimonies, Jewish men were rather unidentified, both as a collective group and to a large extent as individuals due to their reluctance to provide personal recollections. This issue, combined with fragmentary information in primary sources, meant that while the wider geopolitical factors behind the implementation of coercive research, as well as the personal motivations of the physicians responsible for them, have been considerably analyzed in scholarly publications, details regarding the identities of male victims, including place of birth, age, social background, and education, remain unaddressed. In addition, scholars have not established whether there were any patterns in the inmate selection process. The second aim to be developed will be going beyond the Nazi camp experiences. Up-to-date scholarship has been predominantly focused on the camp experiences of victims of Nazi medical experiments. The engagement of the victims in post-war trials has been occasionally highlighted. However, the narratives presented in these publications concentrated on experiments and the consequential physical and mental injuries. Therefore, the second aim of this paper and project is to develop an interdisciplinary displaced person study. In this instance, a chain of cause and effect will be applied. In other words, a transformation from a prisoner to DP and later to immigrant will be elaborated. The intent is to recreate the immediate several years of their post-war experience, as it was a crucial time in rebuilding their lives. The third aim will be the use of narratives. The amount of surviving documentation regarding Nazi atrocities at Auschwitz is less than 20%. This is caused by the fact that the Nazis managed to destroy most of the evidence before the Red Army entered the camp. As a result, sources relating to sterilization experiments are very limited, and available information is depersonalized. This de facto was the actual reflection of the Nazis' approach towards victims, when the physical and psychological implications were not taken into account. The fragmentary statistical data is not sufficient for shaping complete profiles of victims. Therefore, to comprehend the damage caused to the victims, who either irreversibly lost the ability to bear children or faced a years-long struggle to retrieve the functionality of their reproductive organs, which led to an impairment of their individual conceptions of identity, it is crucial to link primary sources with existing narratives of victims. Now we'll move towards the findings, and firstly I will present you different places to which I had to go and collect my sources, which is actually quite a lot. It involved at least 4 years of work. However, I was asked yesterday by Ken how did it all started, actually, the whole project, and my interest in sterilization victims. I think it was 2009 when I actually went to Oxfam and bought myself a book called Auschwitz in England, which was actually a story of a libel trial between Dering and Uris. So the names of the victims, several victims testified in that trial, however, names were not mentioned, and only camp numbers are shown. But the source that was actually very, very important was the surgical register from block 21. This is one of the pages. I do realize that, first of all, you can barely see it. Second of all, you won't be able to read it. What it presents, you have the number of operation, date, prisoner's number, name, and different diagnoses and procedures. Why is this source important? It gives me a number of the victim and, to some extent, the name. It was a handwritten source, therefore reading the name is very, very difficult. So the second source that was actually very, very interesting and very helpful was the calendar of Auschwitz by Danuta Czech. Having victim's number, I was able to, through that book, estimate when did they arrive to the camp and what was their nationalities and so on and so forth. But first of all, I was able to create certain statistics based on those two sources. So as you can see, the excision of gonades were conducted at Auschwitz in block 21 between the 6th of May and the 10th of November 1943. Studying took me at least 2 weeks to study back and forth the medical register. 190 operations were performed on 137 male prisoners. 55 victims were Greek and 82 were Polish. 8 of those Polish victims were in fact arrested and brought from France or Belgium. However, they were originally from Poland. What is very interesting, actually, and should be mentioned is between the 6th of May and the 10th of November 1943, at Block 21, the total of 3,862 operations were performed. and 190 of those were related to sterilization experiments. Why do I say that? Because often people think that, scholars tend to think that Block 21 was an experimental block. It was not. In fact, the 190 was roughly 0.5% of the operations performed in that place. So, based on the information provided by the Danuta Czech, I was able to see through the camp numbers when did they arrive at the camp. And as you can see, as I mentioned, 82 victims were coming from Poland, 55 from Greece. Based on those statistics, you can kind of come out with reasons for selections. If you look at the Polish side, or perhaps, unfortunately I can't show you exactly where the regions were. Victims were coming from two regions. The first one, Rejon Ciechanowski, is above Warsaw, and the other one was around Katowice. So coming back to it, 45% of Poles who were sterilized and later operated at Block 21 were coming from either Nowy Dwór, Płońsk and Mława, and then 34% from Będzin and Sosnowiec. Nearly all 55 Greek victims were coming from Saloniki. Most of victims were selected upon arrival, or at least their numbers were noted upon arrival, because from the Poles who were coming from region Ciechanowski, they were exposed to X-ray sterilization in late 1942. And then later in May, June, August, and November, they were sent to Block 21 for operations. Whereas Poles coming from Będzin and Sosnowiec, who arrived quite late actually, in August 1943, they were literally, after 4 weeks of quarantine, sent directly to be sterilized and then operated. Moving on, several sources helped me to estimate age of victims. Various sources present that most of them were teenagers, which the large group, as you can see, were between 16 and 21, the second largest group between 22 and 26. However, a very small number of victims were already in their 30s and 40s, and I don't want to say they were in better position, but to some extent they were, because they were already married and they had children before they entered the camp. Whereas several of those boys, I can say, undergone complete castration before even they started their intimate life. Further down, the vast majority of the experiment subject left the camp and death marches before the Soviets entered Auschwitz. Thus, the data presented in DP cards, especially care maintenance files, of a great importance. Here is one example of a DP card. Information, so this is not the best DP card, I have to say, however, due to the Data Protection Act and the sensitivity of files, I chosen just the one person that came out in written biography. But normally, what the DP cards present is where they were born, what's their name, parents' name, where would they like to go, i.e. where would they like to immigrate to, which country, and what was their profession, which languages could they speak, and so on and so forth. So, sorry. According to certain sources, not only DP cards, but DP cards were a very, very valuable source. I was able to estimate a certain statistics, countries to which victims went. So the vast majority, as far as I'm concerned, only one Polish victim remained in Poland. And one might think that important factor were pogroms and in general anti-Semitism. However, Greek victims did not remain in Greece either, and that possibly was caused by the political situation in Greece. So the two countries that most of victims went to is Israel and the United States. Mostly, this is quite actually interesting, the Greek victims ended up in Israel, whereas Polish spread out slightly more. I will be speaking to this morning's speaker because one of the victims I know for a fact ended up in Argentina, so perhaps you'll be able to help me with some information. So this is not a complete list, only these victims that I have files from. One victim, which is actually quite interesting, only one person ended up in the UK. That man was a Polish Jew, born in 1927. There's a very good chance that he's still alive. However, I have massive difficulties in tracking him down. According to my estimations, one victim is still alive and lives in Brooklyn. Well, I'm not sure whether, I probably haven't mentioned it, from amongst those 137 victims who were operated on, 132 survived the war, so it's actually quite a high percentage. Moving on to narratives. I've mentioned that men were reluctant towards leaving any recollections or giving testimonies. This is a table that presents you how many of them published diaries, only one. How many of them left recorded recollections? 4. However, 2 of them did not mention anything about sterilization. Legal evidence. In general, I tend to break down the narratives between the personal accounts and legal evidence. What's the difference between them two? The personal accounts give you the whole story. Where the person was born, where they go to school, whether it was religious or not, and what happened during the war. Whereas the legal evidence, there was a certain purpose why the evidence was given. So either trial or compensation claims. When we take into consideration trials, the prosecutors were interested in wartime experiences, what happened to them during the war. They were not interested in what happened after the war. Whereas compensation claims, the trouble with those narratives is there were money involved in the whole process. So both narratives are equally important. However, the rationale has to be, you have to take into account what was the purpose of it. I've encountered several issues, several problems during my research. One of them is victims change their names all the time. So an example here, Jakub Skornik. He was born as a Jakub Skornik. His name was spelled differently according to different sources because, for instance, in DP, in the place person camps, if it was, for instance, an American officer who could not speak Polish, here's the name, spelled it wrongly, so the name appears in different sources in different ways, so you kind of need to bear in mind most of the time the date of birth and a camp number to try to connect these two. So as you can see, Skornik was Skornik, 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 and then he changed his name onto Jack Oren. So if not the fact that I had his camp number, I would never connect. It's the same person. Second issue is the content of narratives. As you can see, this is actually a biography of Jack Oran. The first page says, a Mengele experiment. Persons who don't know what the medical experiments and this particular sterilization experiments was all about and who was involved wouldn't see any issue in here. There is an issue. Mengele was not involved in sterilization experiments. In fact, there are several problems with this particular biography. where Jack Horan mentions that Mengele was present in the room when he was operated. He was not. It's impossible. Certain dates do not match. For instance, Jack Horan gave evidence twice, it was Shoah Foundation and Fortnov collection as well, and this is the third, and this is additional. Every single testimony is different. And it is interesting from one point of view, because you can see how the testimony changes, what becomes more prominent, more important, more painful at the same time. But also for a historian of medicine, it's a nightmare, because if you're trying to create certain chain of facts, it's very, very difficult. For instance, for most of people, it doesn't even matter. If Skórnik says during his Shoah testimony that when he arrived at the camp, his father told him, tell him that you're 18, because he said, oh, I was 16 at the time. Well, actually, he was 18. So what's the point of saying that? The trouble with, first of all, I don't have that many testimonies, but and most specialists in oral history would probably throw something at me at this point, because every single testimony is valuable. Of course it is, very valuable. However, when you're trying to paste something together and every single detail is very important, it's quite difficult. The oral histories are not that problematic. However, those testimonies connected to compensation claims are quite problematic. As I said, there is money involved. And often what victims actually did, instead of just presenting what exactly happened, they tried to, probably being afraid that someone might not believe, they added certain details. They do not match. And in some occasions, their applications were rejected. Well, there's also another issue regarding compensation claims is the fact that the German government did not see castration as a medical issue in a further life. If you had a leg amputated, if you were limping, that was a damage, health damage, bigger than losing your testicles, because you could still function in your life, regardless being brutalized awfully. Several men who were completely castrated had issues with their libido, for instance. So carrying out through their life was very, very difficult. And that was probably one of the reasons why they did not speak out about it. What I would like to do just to conclude, in a further research, not only to, first of all, I would like to compare it with women, how women reacted to their experiences, compare testimonies, and also reveal how many of female victims managed to have kids after the war, and how many of men who lost only one testicle managed to have children. But also to see how the testimony changes and how the compensation process looked on both sides, and from different political changes in different countries. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.